Welcome to the Maybe Not So Great Books channel, You Decide. This is lesson 12 of 14, From Framework to Fortune. Cross-book autopsy, over 32 years, from the fourth turning, generational theory across 3 decades by Neil Howe and William Strauss. Read the first book and you get a historian. Read the second and you get a prophet. Read the third and you get a salesman protecting a $70 million brand.
Yeah, it really is a remarkable trajectory to track.
It's wild.
It is, because when we lay these 3 specific texts out, on the autopsy table, starting with generations in 1991,
Right.
moving through the fourth turning in 1997, and then finally landing on that 2023 update, the fourth turning is here.
The retrofit.
Exactly. We are engaging in a very specific kind of forensic analysis. We're basically tracing the life cycle of a grand unified theory of history to see what happens to it when it collides with, well, the messy reality of actual unfolding events.
Real life.
Real life. For you, the listener, the mission of this deep dive today is to really observe how a framework behaves over 3 entire decades.
And I was really struck by the overarching pattern of it all. I mean, we are watching a relatively modest, heavily hedged historical framework.
Very heavily hedged at first.
Right. And we watch it mutate into this ironclad, borderline apocalyptic prophecy.
Yeah.
And then, as the decades roll on and those predictions actually meet reality, we see it transform into this massive corporate consulting empire.
It becomes a product.
Exactly. The sweeping claims expand, the scientific precision just seems to vanish entirely, and the authors quietly erase their own past mistakes right in front of the reader.
It's in plain sight.
Plain sight. But before we get into all deep historical mechanics of how they built this, I want to pose a scenario for you listening right now.
Okay.
Imagine building your entire professional reputation on a deeply specific prediction.
A hard deadline.
Yes. You look at the trajectory of American history, and you declare that a massive, society-altering crisis, the climax of an era, will be resolved by the year 2025.
You put a pin right in the calendar.
You build a brand on it, you sell millions of books, and then 2025 comes and goes.
Which is, well, it's the ultimate stress test for any intellectual framework, right?
Right.
If we look at this through the lens of just basic science, the scientific method, the protocol is pretty clear. When your hypothesis fails to materialize in the real world,
Could have to change it.
you are obligated to revise the hypothesis, you analyze the data, you isolate the variable that threw off the model, and you transparently publish your findings on why the prediction failed.
But when your theory is the foundational intellectual property of a multi-million-dollar corporate consulting firm,
The incentives shift dramatically.
very dramatically.
The approach we see in the 2023 text is not to admit the error, it's to just quietly adjust the timeline.
Just slide it over.
The catastrophic deadline of 2025 is seamlessly moved to the mid-2030s. A new edition is published, and the delay is presented not as a failure of the model.
But as proof of it,
Exactly, as a confirmation of its profound elasticity.
I was actually looking at the side-by-side comparisons of the text from 1997 and 2023 last night.
Oh, the juxtaposition is glaring.
It really is.
Yeah.
In the 1997 book, Strauss and Howe were incredibly explicit. They wrote that a crisis catalyst would arrive, and I quote, roughly around the year 2005.
2005.
They mapped out this whole trajectory where the crisis would reach its boiling point around 2020. And the whole sequence, this great gate in history, would be resolved sometime before the year 2025.
Right.
But when you open the 2023 book, the fourth turning is here. That specific 2005 catalyst prediction, it's entirely absent.
Go on.
It has been scrubbed. Instead, the narrative has been retroactively massaged.
Massaged is a polite word for it.
Right. Well, at first, the 2008 financial crisis is positioned as the inciting incident. But then, as the real-world timeline dragged on, 2008 is downgraded to a mere pre-catalyst tremor.
A tremor.
And the true catalyst is suddenly declared to be the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic.
Which fundamentally alters the nature of what they are selling to you. We are examining the anatomy of an unfalsifiable theory here. A theory that is designed to be so incredibly elastic and so perfectly vague in its operational definitions that it can absorb absolutely any geopolitical or economic outcome without ever technically breaking.
If the major crisis doesn't happen when the model predicted, the authors simply claim the previous cycle stretched longer than usual.
Yep. Or if a massive historical event happens that doesn't perfectly fit the archetype of the era.
It's just dismissed as an anomaly.
Yeah.
Or a false start.
Exactly. It is brilliant brand management.
It really is.
But it is deeply problematic as a social science.
Absolutely. And to understand how the theory got to this point, we really need to look at the cultural and intellectual environment it was born into. We have to go all the way back to 1991.
1991.
The geopolitical landscape is just shifting under everyone's
The
feet.
Berlin Wall has fallen.
The Soviet Union is in the process of dissolving. The Cold War is ending. Francis Fukuyama has just published his essay, which later became the book The End of History and the Last Man.
Right. That prevailing mood in the West.
Especially in academia, there was this triumphant idea that Western liberal democracy had essentially won the ideological evolution of humanity.
History was over.
Right. But there was this lingering question of, well, what comes next? And into this void step, William Strauss and Neil Howe with their first book, Generations, The History of America's Future, 1584 to 2069.
The tone of Generations is fascinating when you compare it to the later works.
It really is.
It reads like a scholarly exploration. I mean, they set out to catalog 18 distinct American generations,
Easy.
tracing them all the way back to the Puritan era in 1584, right up to the millennial generation who were just being born at the time.
Right.
And they introduced a genuinely interesting methodological concept, reading history diagonally.
Explain that for the listener.
Sure. So instead of just looking at cross-sections of time, say the year 1950, and looking at what everyone's doing at that exact moment, they proposed tracking specific birth cohorts as they aged through different phases of life.
Following the group through time.
Exactly. And they built a taxonomy of 4 repeating generational archetypes: the idealist, the reactive, the civic, and the adaptive.
Those are the original names.
Yes, the 1991 names. But the most striking feature of the 1991 text is its academic caution.
The modesty in their initial claims is almost jarring once you know where the theory ends up.
Totally jarring.
In Generations, they explicitly warn the reader there is no such thing as one universal life cycle.
Right.
They are highly careful not to flatten the human experience. They emphasize that these patterns are broad tendencies, not inescapable destinies.
Mm-hmm.
And they even point out a glaring anomaly in their own supposedly repeating cycle. They admit that during the American Civil War era, the 4-part generational pattern simply broke.
It just didn't work.
It skipped a generation entirely. Specifically, it skipped the civic archetype.
Which is a huge deal.
It is, because in their framework, the civic type is supposed to be the heroic, institution-building generation that fights the great wars and rebuilds society. And the Civil War, arguably our biggest war, didn't have one.
That admission regarding the Civil War is incredibly significant from a structural standpoint. We need to look closely at the underlying mechanics of their theory to understand why skipping a generation is so devastating to their mathematical model.
Yeah, let's break down the math.
Strauss and Howe base their entire framework on the concept of the seculum.
Right.
This is an ancient Etruscan concept that represents the length of a long human life, roughly 80 to 90 years.
Okay.
The idea was that a seculum is the amount of time it takes for the last living person who remembers the previous great foundational event of a society to die out.
Once that living memory is gone, society repeats the cycle.
Exactly. So they took this 80 to 90 year seculum and divided it into 4 turnings, or seasons, each lasting about 20 to 22 years.
You have the high, the awakening, the unraveling, and the crisis.
Correct. The math relies on this sequence of 4 20-year blocks perfectly stacking on top of one another to equal one 80-year seculum.
Right.
But human reproduction and historical events don't operate on a perfectly calibrated 20-year metronome.
They don't check a calendar.
No. When they admitted in 1991 that the Civil War cycle skipped the civic generation, they were admitting that a massive 20-year block of their 80-year cycle simply didn't happen.
It just vanished.
And if you remove a 20-year segment from an 80-year cycle, the math of the seculum is completely broken. The clock is thrown off entirely.
Yeah.
Yet in 1991, they were comfortable admitting this. They openly stated that it had shown this one major aberration. They were functioning as historians, offering a lens through which to view the past.
Right.
And they explicitly wrote, anyone who claims to possess a vision of the future must present it with due modesty.
Due modesty. I found myself rereading that phrase several times because the pivot that happens over the next 6 years is monumental.
It's a completely different mindset.
By 1997, when they published The Fourth Turning, the cultural climate in America has shifted again.
The 90s optimism was fading.
Fading fast. The dot-com bubble is inflating. There's growing political polarization leading up to the Clinton impeachment. And the anxiety surrounding Y2K is really starting to seep into the public consciousness.
People were looking for certainty.
They wanted answers. And the book Strauss and Howe, delivered in 1997, completely abandons the academic caution of 1991. The subtitle of The Fourth Turning is literally An American Prophecy.
The linguistic transformation alone is profound.
Oh,
The
definitely.
relatively dry sociological labels they used in 1991 are given this mythological overhaul.
Right, the rebranding.
The idealist generation is rebranded as the prophet.
Sounds much more epic.
The reactive generation becomes the nomad. The civic generation is elevated to the hero.
Wow.
And the adaptive generation is turned into the artist. This is no longer the language of demographic study. It is the language of Joseph Campbell and epic narrative.
It's storytelling.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And as the vocabulary becomes more grandiose, the stakes of the theory are escalated to apocalyptic levels.
I actually pulled the exact text from the 1997 edition to see exactly what they were forecasting, because they weren't just predicting a minor economic downturn.
No.
They laid out 5 specific crisis scenarios that could trigger the next fourth turning. These included global terrorism, severe pandemics, and complete constitutional collapse.
Heavy stuff.
And they warned that this impending crisis could result in an omnicidal Armageddon. The exact quote is, "This fourth turning could mark the end of man."
It is incredibly dark, fatalistic material.
It really is.
The irony is that we see an inverse relationship developing between empirical evidence and the author's confidence.
I mean,
Well, when they were looking backward in 1991, analyzing centuries of documented historical data, they were modest. They admitted the flaws in their model.
because they had to respect the actual data.
Right. But in 1997, as they pivoted toward forecasting the future, a domain where, by definition, zero empirical evidence exists.
You can't measure tomorrow.
Exactly. Their confidence in their precise timeline became absolute. The framework transitioned from a descriptive tool used to interpret the past into a rigid, prescriptive engine for predicting the future.
We really have to dig into the specific predictions they made in 1997, because this is where the theory truly collides with the reality of the last 3 decades.
Let's do it.
They didn't just predict a generic bad time. They made structural forecasts about the American economy and political system.
Very specific ones.
For instance, they predicted that during the crisis period, income inequality would stop growing and begin to narrow as society banded together to face the threat.
Which, as we know from the economic data of the 21st century, was spectacularly incorrect.
Beyond incorrect.
If we look at the Gini coefficient and wealth distribution metrics from 1997 to the present day, income inequality didn't just fail to narrow, it accelerated to Gilded Age levels.
Right.
The top 1% of wealth holders captured a vastly disproportionate share of economic growth throughout the 2008 financial crisis and the 2020 pandemic.
The wealth gap widened dramatically during the exact period they predicted it would close.
It did the exact opposite of what the hero generation was supposed to facilitate.
And speaking of the hero generation, they also explicitly predicted that the American workforce would become significantly more unionized. They argued that the hero archetype, the millennials, would band together in massive civic institutions and revitalize organized labor.
That was a core pillar of the prediction.
But if you pull the data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the overall union membership rate has continued a steady, decades-long decline, dropping to historic lows.
Yeah.
And politically, they predicted that one of the major political parties would achieve decisive, long-term dominance as the public united behind a single vision to navigate the crisis.
Instead, we experienced an era of hyperpolarization, razor-thin electoral margins, and power alternating between the parties at a dizzying rate.
Red to blue to red to blue.
Exactly. The exact opposite of a unified, dominant political consensus emerged. The structural, economic, and political predictions they made in 1997 failed almost across the board.
Which brings us to the 2023 update. The fourth turning is here.
We have to acknowledge the context of this publication.
Right, because William Strauss tragically passed away in 2007.
So for the last 16 years leading up to the 2023 book, Neil Howe has been operating as the solo author
The sole interpreter of the framework.
and the protector of the commercial brand.
That's a huge point.
The phenomenon of solo authorship over a legacy intellectual property often leads to an echo chamber effect.
Nobody to push back.
Exactly. When you lack a peer, especially the co-architect of the original theory, to challenge your interpretations, confirmation bias tends to flourish.
You just see what you want to see.
And we see this heavily in what forensic reviews of the 2023 book call the retrofit.
The retrofit, I love that term.
When you place the 1997 text beside the 2023 text, the retroactive revisionism is stark.
Let's talk about that missing 2005 catalyst again. As we noted, 1997 explicitly predicted the trigger event would happen roughly around 2005.
Right.
In 2023, Howe has to deal with the fact that 2005 came and went without a civilization-defining crisis. So the book initially tries to argue that the 2008 global financial crisis was the catalyst.
It's a few years late, but it's a major event.
Sure, it works well enough.
Yeah.
But then, as the 2010s drag on without the final apocalyptic climax they promised, Howe shifts the goalposts again.
He has to.
In the 2023 text, he declares that the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic was the true catalyst. And he retroactively downgrades the 2008 financial crash to a pre-catalyst.
It's akin to an economic forecaster who predicts a massive recession every single quarter for 15 straight years.
Right.
Eventually, a global supply chain shock or a pandemic causes a recession, and the forecaster takes a victory lap, claiming their model was perfectly accurate.
Look, I was right all along.
You do not get scientific credit for forecasting an event if the mechanism that triggered it was completely unrelated to your model, and if you continually push the date back until something eventually broke.
It's just confirmation bias on a massive scale.
And the recycling of the material is another major red flag.
Like a sheer amount of copy-pasting.
Independent reviewers who analyzed The Fourth Turning is here noted that approximately 50% of the book is repackaged material from the 1997 original.
Half the book.
The entire theoretical architecture, the seculum, the four turnings, the four archetypes, is completely unchanged. Chapters 1 through 5 of the 2023 book are functionally a condensed rewrite of the concepts published 26 years earlier.
Think about the magnitude of what happened in the world between 1997 and 2023, though.
It's staggering.
We saw the proliferation of the internet, the rise of ubiquitous smartphones and social media,
The sequencing of the human genome.
artificial intelligence, unprecedented shifts in global trade, a theory that claims predictive power regarding human behavior should be deeply refined and updated when confronted with technological revolutions of that scale.
It should evolve.
Yes, the fact that the framework remained entirely static, that it was merely reapplied with updated cohort labels like Gen Z, suggests intellectual rigidity rather than a robust, adaptable science.
They simply shoehorned modern events, like the Ukraine war and the pandemic, into the exact same boxes they built in the 1990s.
I was looking at the actual business model behind this yesterday, and the numbers are just staggering.
This is where it's really interesting.
You have to ask why a theory would remain so static, why they would quietly erase mispredictions rather than honestly revising the model. And the answer seems to lie in the corporate fortune they built.
The $70 million brand,
Following the massive mainstream success of the books, the authors founded Life Course Associates.
which eventually became Howe Generational Consulting.
They took this academic taxonomy, the idea that millennials are heroes, Gen X are nomads, boomers are prophets, and turned it into a highly lucrative corporate product.
The generational consulting industry became an estimated $70 million annual market.
That is a lot of money to protect.
Howe's speaking fees are reported to range from $30,000 to $50,000 per keynote address.
Per speech.
And the client list is not composed of fringe groups. We are talking about the core of the American corporate and institutional establishment. They have consulted for Nike, Disney, Ford, Fidelity Investments, and Viacom.
They even consulted for the military.
Yes, the Department of Defense.
The U.S. Army and the U.S. Marine Corps brought them in to advise on recruitment and training strategies. The military was looking at these generational archetypes to figure out how to mold the millennial hero into a soldier.
Contrasting it with how they trained the Gen X nomad in the 90s.
Exactly.
This introduces a massive structural conflict of interest.
A glaring one.
When your overarching theory is generating tens of millions of dollars in consulting fees and speaking engagements, admitting that the foundational predictions from 1997 were wrong is no longer an academic exercise.
It's not just a footnote in a journal.
It is a catastrophic business risk. You are financially incentivized to maintain the absolute illusion of accuracy.
If you walk into a boardroom at Disney and admit that the cycle is flawed, or that these generational archetypes are largely sweeping caricatures,
You're done.
you cannot justify a $50,000 invoice to explain how to market consumer products to millennial heroes. The entire business model rests on the framework being treated by executives as an infallible scientific law of nature.
The synergy of the business model is highly effective. Think about it. The books build the intellectual credibility. The credibility secures the high-profile speaking invitations, and the keynote speeches act as a funnel for the massive long-term consulting contracts.
That's a perfect loop.
And because the theory naturally points toward this existential apocalyptic fourth turning crisis, it is a brilliant sales tool.
Fear sells.
It manufactures a sense of profound, urgent panic among executives and institutional leaders. A panic that only the proprietary consultant can soothe with their specific paid insights.
We've tracked this evolution from the cautious historian to the confident prophet, and finally to the salesman managing a corporate brand.
Right.
But I want to connect this directly to you, the listener. How this impacts the world you are navigating right now in 2026. Why should you care about the structural flaws of a theory developed in the 1990s?
You should care because we are currently living in a golden age of corporate astrology.
Corporate astrology, that is exactly what it is.
Every single day, highly packaged proprietary frameworks are aggressively marketed to business leaders, policymakers, and the general public. Real-world decisions about hiring, resource allocation, urban planning, and marketing are being made based on these heavily funded narratives.
Let's ground this in a scenario you've probably experienced.
Yeah.
We have all been in that windowless corporate conference room, sitting through a mandatory HR seminar while a highly paid external consultant explains that the company needs to completely restructure its management style because of generational differences.
It happens every day.
They stand by a projector and tell you that millennials demand purpose because they are heroes, or Gen Z lacks institutional loyalty, or that Gen X is cynical because they are nomads.
It's so reductive.
Your company is spending vast sums of money to segment you and your colleagues based entirely on your birth years. They treat these archetypes as if they are biological realities.
Which brings us to the most devastating counter-evidence against this entire industry.
Let's hear the science.
The National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, NASEM, conducted an exhaustive, multidisciplinary review of generational theory in the workplace.
This wasn't just a casual study?
No. This is the premier scientific body in the country. Their conclusion was definitive. Categorizing workers with generational labels is explicitly not supported by empirical research. It is a manufactured construct.
As anyone who follows demographic science closely knows, the pushback from the scientific community has been massive.
Huge pushback.
An open letter signed by 150 credentialed demographers urged the Pew Research Center, which is the gold standard of demographic data in the US, to stop using generational labels entirely.
And they did.
Yes. In 2023, Pew largely abandoned the generational framing, acknowledging that it obscures more than it reveals.
Kurt Rudolph, an organizational psychologist referenced in the deep research for this deep dive, stated point blank that categorizing workers by generation is no more scientific than categorizing them by their astrological sign.
So why do we keep doing it?
The reason it persists, despite the scientific consensus dismantling it, is psychological comfort.
Comfort.
Human behavior, especially in a diverse workforce of thousands of individuals, is incredibly complex, chaotic, and difficult to manage.
It's messy.
Very messy. So when an HR director or a CEO is faced with that overwhelming complexity, the idea that you can neatly sort everyone into 4 predictable boxes based solely on their birth year is incredibly seductive.
It reduces anxiety.
It reduces anxiety by providing a false sense of certainty and control. Corporations pay millions for the framework, not because it is scientifically valid, but because it feels good to have a simple answer.
I want to address the underlying methodology they use to build these archetypes, specifically the millennial profile, because it reveals exactly how skewed this data is.
The Fairfax County data.
Exactly. When Strauss and Howe were defining the traits of the hero archetype that would supposedly define an entire generation, they relied heavily on surveys of about 600 high school teenagers.
Which isn't a massive sample size to begin with.
No. But more importantly, they didn't take a representative sample of the American population. They surveyed students from Fairfax County, Virginia.
For context, Fairfax County in the 1990s was, and largely remains, one of the wealthiest, most highly educated, and demographically insulated counties in the entire United States.
It's a very specific bubble.
It is a hub of affluent suburbs surrounding Washington, D.C., populated heavily by government contractors, lobbyists, and high-earning professionals.
So they took the specific behaviors, anxieties, and aspirations of rich, predominantly white suburban kids in Fairfax County, combined it with a hodgepodge of pop culture anecdotes from movies and television, and extrapolated that to represent tens of millions of wildly diverse Americans.
It's scientifically absurd. The sociologist Siva Vaidyanathan coined a perfect phrase for this. He called generational theory a benign form of bigotry.
A benign form of bigotry.
Because the framework insists that a wealthy teenager born in a gated community in Fairfax County shares a profound, unbreakable peer personality with a teenager born into systemic poverty in rural Alabama in the exact same year.
Right?
It insists they have more in common with each other simply because of their birth year than they do with people of their own exact socioeconomic background who happen to be born a decade earlier.
It systematically erases race, class, geography, and individual life experience in favor of a monolithic, unscientific destiny.
It really does.
You listening to this right now, you need to develop a radar for this. You have to recognize when a framework is a genuinely useful heuristic and when it is an investable narrative designed to sell consulting hours.
Yeah, exactly.
When a theory strips away your individuality and reduces you to a predetermined archetype, it ceases to be analysis and becomes an exercise in stereotyping.
Which leads us directly to the core limitation of the Strauss-Howe theory. The fatal flaw that breaks the entire machine is the concept of unfalsifiability.
I want to unpack this limitation carefully, because every theory has an edge case, but this seems structural. If a framework is unfalsifiable, how does that actually manifest in their timeline?
Well, in the philosophy of science, for a theory to be taken seriously, it must be falsifiable. There must be a specific condition, a clear, observable event that could occur and conclusively prove the theory wrong.
You have to be able to fail.
Right. If a model is so vague that it can explain absolutely every outcome post facto, and it predicts nothing specific enough to ever fail, it is useless as a scientific or analytical tool. It is essentially a literary device.
We talked about the saeculum earlier, that 80 to 100 plus year cycle. Let's look at the built-in elasticity of that math.
The stretchiness.
Exactly. The master cycle has a 20-year window of flexibility right off the bat.
Yeah.
Could be 80 years, it could be 100 years. Within that, each of the 4 turnings is defined as lasting roughly 20 to 25 years.
So you have a built-in 5 to 10-year margin of error for every single phase of the historical cycle.
Which is massive.
It is. If a major geopolitical event doesn't fit the exact year they predicted, the model doesn't break. They simply declare that the unraveling phase lasted a little longer than average.
Right.
If the ultimate crisis isn't resolved by 2025, as boldly predicted in 1997, they just stretch the timeline and say this is a particularly long winter turning, so it will actually resolve in the mid-2030s. The theory possesses decades of built-in slack.
It reminds me of the co-author problem we touched on. With William Strauss passing away in 2007, the massive retroactive revisions and goalpost shifts in the 2023 book were made by Howe alone.
Right.
The original predictions in 1997 were a joint intellectual product. We have absolutely no way to verify if Strauss, who was deeply involved in the historical and narrative architecture of the theory, would have agreed to retroactively change their joint predictions to fit the 2008 crash or the COVID-19 pandemic.
It highlights the danger of an intellectual framework becoming a solo echo chamber. When the sole remaining author is also the CEO of the consulting business, dependent on the theory's perceived infallibility, there is no internal mechanism for correction.
Nobody to say stop.
There is no one in the room to look at the data and say, we predicted a decisive political realignment and a narrowing of wealth inequality by 2020, and the opposite happened. We have to publish a retraction.
Instead, the echo chamber figures out how to rebrand the misses as hits, or simply omits the failed predictions entirely from the new edition.
But to be fair,
Yes, let's pivot here.
if we are putting this theory on the autopsy table, we can't just look at the critics and the failures. We need to explore the debate angle. Let's play devil's advocate for a second.
Okay, let's hear it.
If I am defending Howe and the legacy of this theory, I might argue that we are being far too harsh on the specific dates and missing the broader forest for the trees.
That is a very valid intellectual exercise. Let's look at side A, the defense of the Strauss-Howe framework.
Defenders argue that forecasting macro-sociological movements is fundamentally different from physics or hard science. You cannot predict the exact trajectory of human societies the way you predict the orbit of a planet.
It's not a math equation.
Right. From that perspective, predicting a major crisis catalyst within a 15-year window is actually a remarkably tight forecast when you are measuring centuries of geopolitical history.
A defender would look at the broad strokes of American history since 2000 and say, Look at the mood of the country.
Yeah, look at the general vibe.
Did institutional trust collapse in the early 2000s, right on schedule for an unraveling? Yes. Did political polarization and civic decay reach crisis levels during the 2010s? Yes.
Did a massive, globally disruptive event, the pandemic, radically alter society in 2020? Yes.
Exactly. The defenders point out that the thematic progression of the cycle, from the high of the post-WWII era, to the awakening of the 1960s and 70s, to the unraveling of the 90s and 2000s, and into the crisis era we are in now, has held up surprisingly well in terms of the national zeitgeist.
The specific catalyst may have been unpredictable, whether it was subprime mortgages or a novel coronavirus, but the underlying vulnerability of the society evolved exactly as they foresaw.
They would argue that updating a timeline from 2025 to 2035 isn't a nefarious shifting of the goalposts. It is simply the natural maturation of a theory gathering new data.
As events unfold, you refine the model.
Right. You don't throw out the entire concept of seasons just because winter arrived a month late one year.
That is the strongest defense of the work. However, we must weigh that against side B, the critique.
And the sociological critique of this defense is devastatingly simple and mathematically sound.
If I am a critic looking at that defense, my counterargument is that a prediction window wide enough to claim credit for the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the 2008 global financial crash, and the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic isn't a prediction at all.
It's just a statistical guarantee.
Exactly. If you look back at any 20-year span in American history, you will find a massive society-altering crisis.
Every single time.
The Great Depression, World War II, the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil War, the War of 1812. History is not a peaceful baseline interrupted by rare crises. It is an endless sequence of overlapping crises.
So if you stand on a stage and tell an audience, sometime in the next 20 years, America will experience a massive disruptive geopolitical or economic event, you aren't a prophet.
You are just someone who has a passing familiarity with history.
Pointing to a 20-year window and saying bad things will occur is essentially a parlor trick wrapped in academic language.
Furthermore, the critics emphasize that the theory crosses the line from legitimate geopolitical forecasting into fortune-telling precisely when it refuses to acknowledge its specific failures.
Right. When you predict a surge in unionization and a closing of the wealth gap, and the data shows plummeting union membership and record-breaking wealth inequality, you cannot simply ignore those metrics in your next book and claim your broader mood prediction was correct.
That selective editing of history is what transforms the theory into corporate astrology.
Which brings us to the ultimate takeaway.
How do you, the listener, arm yourself against this kind of intellectual sleight of hand?
We want to leave you with one highly specific practical tool you can use on Monday morning.
We call it the falsifiability test.
It is a beautifully simple, highly effective intellectual tool. The next time a consultant, a political pundit, a financial forecaster, or a best-selling author pitches you a grand, sweeping framework.
Whether they're trying to solve your company's hiring problems, explain the macroeconomy, or predict the next global conflict,
you need to ask them one specific question.
Ask them, what specific event would have to happen to prove your theory wrong?
That's the golden question.
What would break your model? If they cannot give you a specific, concrete answer, or worse, if they smile and explain how their brilliant model can actually account for any possible outcome, you need to walk away.
You are not buying a strategy, and you are not buying science. You are buying an expensive, highly marketed story.
Keep your money.
It is a vital filter for navigating the information age, and it leaves us with a final, provocative thought for you to mull over.
We have spent this time dissecting the supply side of this equation, how a historical theory transformed into an inflexible mythology in order to sustain a $70 million consulting brand.
We've looked at the authors, the text revisions, and the speaking fees.
But we have to consider the demand side. We have to look at ourselves.
That's the uncomfortable part.
Are we as a society so anxious and so desperate for order in a chaotic, unpredictable world that we are willing to willfully fund a $70 million industry, even when we can see the authors erasing their own past mistakes in plain sight?
When millions of people buy these books and executives mandate these seminars, are they really buying them to gain actionable insight into the future?
Or are they just buying them to soothe their deep existential fear of the unknown?
That was lesson 12 of 14 on The Fourth Turning, Generational Theory Across 3 Decades. Subscribe for the full series. If you haven't seen our debate overview of the whole book, check that out, link in the description. Thanks for being here. See you next time.